a writer and researcher. My website is unlimitedhangout.com. I was senior investigative reporter at Mint Press News, and before that was a staff writer there. And I've been writing professionally since 2016. I'm currently 33 years old.
So investigative journalist, writing as of 2016. If I may ask, born and raised, what part of the world?
So I grew up in Florida, Sarasota. I ended up leaving. I went to college at Davidson, which is in North Carolina. And then not long after that, I moved. I took a job in South America and have pretty much been in South America since then.
And when you say
I'm still here. My family is mostly is like Scott Irish or British in general.
Parents, what did they do for a living?
My mom was a stay-at-home mom. My dad's a lawyer.
So you're 33. What did you study in university to get into what you're doing now?
I double majored. One major was in biology, but really more focused on like agroecology. I was really interested in self-sufficiency and like growing my own food, but it's been a long time since I've worked in that world. So when I left university, I ended up helping manage a farm in South America. That's how I first sort of came down here. And then my other major was in religion, but in the academic study of religions, more like interdisciplinary. So a mix of history and anthropology. And even before then, I used to work part-time as a translator for scientific papers written by Chilean academics and universities here into English so they can be published in international journals.
And I'm not familiar with Mint Press, but what type of publication is Mint Press?
So Mint Press is like an online publication. They focus on a lot of different stuff, mostly approaching things from like an anti-imperialist point of view. So, they do a lot of stuff on geopolitics, very critical of U.S. and generally Western foreign policy. They cover a lot of stuff. At least when I was there, I covered a lot of stuff about intelligence agencies in Silicon Valley, there is a lot of focus on the Israel-Palestine conflict at Mint Press as well. So when I was there, I did a lot of coverage on that. And I left in 2020, set up my own site, Unlimited Hangout. And I also teamed up with Ryan Christian of The Last American Vagabond. And we've done collaborative stuff on and off over the years together. And hopefully now that the book is done, I can, be a more regular contributor to his project as well. So
you're journalizing for Mint Press 2020. I guess this is just at COVID or just before, or is it?
Yeah. So I mean, I really liked Mint Press and liked writing for them. But in early 2020, people were getting censored, including like biggish sites like Zero Hedge, for example, for talking about things like the lab leak theory, which of course there's been a 180 on that since then. And so I was writing a piece for them that was about DARPA and the Wuhan Institute of Virology and gain of function stuff back in January 2020, before the lockdowns and the craziness really. And, they were worried about getting censored for putting it out. And I put it out on my friend's site, The Last American Vagabond.
Explain what Event 201 is. We both know, but some people are going to freak out when you say this. They'll think it's conspiracy.
Okay. That was the World Economic Forum, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Open Philanthropy, which is Facebook co-founder Dustin Moskovitz. And it was basically simulating a novel coronavirus outbreak in, I think, October 2019 that spreads around the world and necessitates censoring, misinformation, and lockdowns and all other sorts of stuff, and novel therapeutics and vaccines and whatever. And it wasn't the only, actually, in 2019 scenario simulation like that. The U.S. military, in conjunction with Robert Kadlec at HHS, ran something called Crimson Contagion throughout most of the year of 2019 that was also simulating a coronavirus. I think it was a pandemic influenza, but more or less some sort of coronavirus outbreak globally that shuts everything down. And it was, a very extensive simulation. And I think you had even more than just those two in 2019 alone. And most of these simulations I talked about just now are hosted or written or planned largely by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, as it's known today. But the person that was in charge of that for a long time, Tyra O'Toole, is now at the CIA. You know, she was the mentor for a long time to a man named Thomas Inglesby, and he was the moderator at Event 201. But Avril Haines, so she's technically in charge of all 18 U.S. intelligence agencies, including the CIA, right now, and she's there at Event 201. You know, more often than not, what they end up concluding in these simulations, if you look at it over time, we need a global government. That's the only way. And they have these sorts of, I would argue they're sort of baked in conclusions, and they conduct the simulation to justify why this solution is the best policy for something that hasn't happened yet. Like they're planning in advance the policies they want to enact when when the particular event they're simulating comes to pass. And on two of these occasions, with Dark Winter and then with Event 201, we have those events follow in just a few months after they're simulated. And if you look at other events in history, September 11th, 2001 is a good example. There's, a series of odd simulations that precede those events, and it's happened in other cases as well.
Event 201 in 2019 about a global pandemic. I mean, and it's like they played it out like the movie Contagion, as to not this is what's going to happen, but rather this is what we're going to do. All right, so that was all in the context of you going out on your own, seeing a bit of ahead of the curve, and also seeing ahead of the curve of the censorship. So you start your own website, and it's called what was it called again?
Unlimitedhangout.com.
And then what happens? So what happens after that? The world is on lockdown. Are you in Chile? And
yeah, I'm in Chile. The lockdowns here were awful. It was basically like being under house arrest. And then once the vaccine came out, they were like, if you get vaccinated, you get this vaccine passport, and then you can leave your house whenever you want. So don't get vaccinated, you're under house arrest forever. Get vaccinated, you can have your freedom back. Right? And so a lot of people did it. And now, including kids 3 and up, that's how, and it was really pervasive. I think between 3 and 5, like 50% of kids got vaccinated. And then above that, from like 6 to 17, it's like close to 80 something, maybe 90%, really high. And so you have kids like in daycares here having heart attacks. You have kids in middle school recess, just dropping. And, the Chilean media acts like nothing happened. But I think if people hadn't been so poorly treated, basically treated like criminals, because of the quarantines and stuff, I don't think the vaccine uptake would have been so high. People were really desperate to live their lives again. And so, I found it just awful. But anyway, Chile's not exclusive in that sense, but it's definitely paying the price, I think now. But anyway, it's a history of corruption leading up to Epstein, because you can't really understand what Jeffrey Epstein was up to unless you understand the context, right? So mainstream media has painted Jeffrey Epstein as an anomaly, right? And basically the narrative is, well, yeah, he was a bad guy, we'll admit that, but now he's dead, so everything's fine. And, that's absurd. Obviously, someone like Epstein was allowed to operate the way he did with everyone knowing about it with impunity because he had a network of support. That network precedes Epstein by a number of years, and it continues to exist now that he's gone. So the problem isn't really Epstein. The problem is the network. And what I start off the book with is talking about something called Operation Underworld. And this is when the U.S. intelligence apparatus, as it existed in the World War II era, they formally aligned themselves with organized crime, specifically the National Crime Syndicate, which was really a combination of the Jewish mob and the Italian mafia. So this particular group of organized criminals get in bed with intelligence, and they basically end up fusing by developing this symbiotic relationship that develops over the years. But it was different, criminal groups that came together because they realized that in collaborating, they could expand their power more rapidly. And when you're organized crime, all you care about is expanding your money and power, expanding your rackets and perpetuating them until the end of time. Basically, the Jewish mob, the Italian mafia, there was Irish organized crime groups, and so on. It was all by different ethnicities. And so the National Crime Syndicate was sort of a team up of Mayor Lansky with Lucky Luciano, and they had been childhood friends, and they realized if they could sort of bridge this ethnic enclave model and collaborate, that they'd be the guys on top in the organized crime world. And they were right about that.
All right.
So these are the people that were involved in all sorts of things well before Operation Underworld, including the takeover of the Democratic Party in New York City. So they basically became, they took over the unions, and then they took over key parts of the groups that were responsible for elections within the party. Yeah, the primaries and vote counting and stuff. And then did a couple threatening of officials here and there, got their people in power. And Operation Underworld ended up happening the way it did because the intelligence apparatus wanted to collaborate closely with the dock workers union in New York City Harbor. And that union was controlled by the mob. So they were like, if you want to work with them, you have to work with the mob, right? And one of the main tactics of this particular crime syndicate was sex blackmail, setting people up and blackmailing them. One of the first prominent people that was blackmailed by people like Mayor Lansky was J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI. And it's for that reason that Hoover never went after organized crime as FBI director. It's very well known now that J. Edgar Hoover was homosexual, but in that period of time, that would have destroyed his career, right? And so they caught him, they took pictures of him and compromising positions with Clyde Tolson. And these were shared with early intelligence people like James Jesus Angleton, who was one of the most prominent counterintelligence people in the CIA from its founding onward. And then they can use that as leverage. So the mob can use it as leverage, and now intelligence can use it as leverage over FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, which is the highest law enforcement body in the United States. What you end up having in the 1980s is this power nexus that becomes responsible for things like Iran-Contra, among other things. And in that particular network, you have a mix of U.S. intelligence, Israeli intelligence, and also an offshoot of the CIA that in the book I call a private CIA. Iran-Contra is really complicated, but anyway, on the Israeli intelligence side of that, you have Robert Maxwell being involved. So Robert Maxwell, his connection to Israeli intelligence goes back to the 60s. He also had a relationship with intelligence agencies, several different intelligence agencies, most specifically the KGB in the Soviet Union, and also Bulgarian intelligence and other Soviet bloc country intelligence. He also had a relationship with British intelligence as well, obviously because he's based in Britain and adopted the name Robert Maxwell. He wasn't born with that name because he served in the British military in World War II. He's originally from Czechoslovakia.
What's his real name?
Jan Ludwig Hoch. Or something like that. Hoch is the last name.
That's British.
Well, he wanted to be a businessman too, right? So in the 60s, including around the time he was recruited by Israeli intelligence, he was also like a Labour MP in Britain. He was trying to build a media empire, which was, based around Pergamon Press. And then he almost loses Pergamon Press and then sort of claws it back and then begins building this media empire. But at the same time, he's involved in intelligence activities as well. And so part of his involvement, for example, with Iran-Contra is with arms dealing. And allegedly in this period of time is when he meets Epstein. And allegedly that's because Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were romantically involved. And that connection was forged that way. That's the allegation. So most people think of Iran-Contra as an arms for hostage scandal. It's actually much more than that. It's very important in the context of what Epstein was doing in the 90s of the Clinton White House to understand Bill Clinton's involvement when he was governor of Arkansas and Iran-Contra stuff. Basically, the problem that Bill Casey, CIA director Bill Casey, had when Congress told him, we're not going to let you finance lethal aid to the Contras in Nicaragua. And so, by that point, Casey had invested a lot of time and money in building up the Contras in Nicaragua to counter the Sandinistas that had taken over control of that country, which previously was basically a U.S. backed dictatorship in Nicaragua. And so he wanted to find a way to get around that, but not just to get around it for the Contras. He wanted to find a way to not ever have to ask Congress for money and thus, have to deal with congressional oversight of his activities again. So he wanted to find a way to basically self-finance covert operations off the books. And so basically what this meant is that in order to do that, you have to produce money that is going to be off the books too. And so this ended up being things like narcotics trafficking, arms trafficking, things like that, and then laundering the money. And then that money becomes utilized by this intelligence apparatus to finance either the Contras, but really more than just the Contras, any paramilitary group you want or any covert operation you want to conduct and you don't want to have to inform Congress or the president about, right? And this got out of hand very quickly, obviously. And there were a lot of efforts to cover it up. If you're familiar with the work of Gary Webb, for example, he exposed one of the major drug angles of the whole thing and had his life ruined for it, you know.
Gary Webb.
But he's been proved right over and over again, you know, even in the years since his death in, I think, 2004.
Gary Webb was the individual who was attributed a suicide to his death with 2 self-inflicted gunshot wounds.
Yeah. And then another journalist who wrote about these same actors and was due to publish a book on them was Danny Casolaro, and he died in 1991 in what was framed as a suicide, but was obviously murder. What Danny Casolaro wrote about was the group behind Iran-Contra and some of their activities. He called this particular group the Octopus. And Jeffrey Epstein was a part of that network 100%. He was involved in, and it's not just through the Maxwell connection either. In this Iran-Contra period, he is, one of his main clients is Adnan Khashoggi, who was one of the main arms dealers and one of the guys that got Iran-Contra off the ground. Epstein was Khashoggi's banker in that period. And Khashoggi's main bank in this period was the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, which was basically a private intelligence apparatus masquerading as a bank. The bank itself was involved in the sex trafficking of minors. The bank, right, that Epstein and Khashoggi and these guys had a relationship with, and which was a major facilitator of these illicit cash flows for off-the-books operations. Because this particular apparatus wasn't just selling weapons to Iran, it was selling weapons to both sides of the Iran-Iraq war.
It's the stuff of nightmares in reality that is too cynical and corrupt for people to actually believe. So the one question, nobody's allowed asking it, or nobody seems to have an answer. And now that he has committed suicide, it's all neatly wrapped up. How did he make his money in life? Epstein, not Maxwell's. How did Epstein make his money?
Yeah, I think he was a serial money launderer, and I think he was a massive financial criminal. And so I think part of the reason the mainstream media only focuses on Epstein from 2000 to 2006 and exclusively on his sex crimes is so they don't have to engage with the financial crime side, which is very extensive. You're looking at someone who was involved in intelligence-linked shadow banking of a major U.S. intelligence scandal, Iran-Contra, and he goes from that to helping mastermind one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in U.S. history at Towers Financial. And despite being named as the mastermind in grand jury proceedings, his name is dropped from the case. And that same year his name was dropped from the case, he's attending very suspect Clinton White House fundraisers, including one in 1993 that, oddly enough, makes an appearance in Vince Foster's quote-unquote suicide note. Hillary Clinton was worried about some stuff as it related to Vince Foster, and this suicide note was planted there to sort of exonerate her about something, right? And given the evidence, that seems what happened. Vince Foster's role, according to the New York Times, would have been to determine if there was anything fishy about the money in that fundraiser. And that's the only mention of Hillary Clinton in there. And so anyway, it's just interesting considering all of that, and then considering that Epstein's name is dropped from a major criminal case. And then he's involved in this fundraiser and shaking hands with Clinton, he and Ghislaine Maxwell, at a donor reception for this fundraiser. And it's the only mention of Hillary Clinton in the suspect suicide note is she and Khaki Hawkersmith, her decorator, did nothing wrong as it related to redecorating the White House. And there was nothing to see here. Just bizarre. And anyway, you go from that, and then the next time Epstein pops up, really, he's involved with a series of meetings with a guy named Mark Middleton, who is dead now under very suspicious circumstances. And Mark Middleton was intimately involved in, depending on who you talk to, a scandal that's either called Chinagate or that's called the 1996 campaign finance controversy. And either way, again, it's dealing with very suspect and very illegal fundraisers around the Clinton family. And then after Clinton leaves office, you have Jeffrey Epstein helping him set up the Clinton Foundation. So you have Jeffrey Epstein just on the Clinton side of things being very involved in suspect money flows throughout the 1990s. And you have that same theme with Leslie Wexner, Jeffrey Epstein's main benefactor that we know of during this same period. So this is obviously a serial financial criminal who was benefiting very powerful people. Why did 5 months later, a guy named Mark Middleton, who was protected not just by Bill Clinton, but by George W. Bush from being prosecuted, why did he, after those revelations and the fact that he was meeting with Epstein 17 times in less than 2 years, he ends up dead in May, hanging by the neck from a tree with an extension cord and a shotgun wound to the chest, and it's ruled a suicide. And no pictures and videos from the scene of of his death are allowed to be publicly released. And why does no one in the U.S. media report on Mark Middleton's death except for local, media in Little Rock, Arkansas? It doesn't get any coverage. Wouldn't that matter in the US? Why won't they talk about it? Why won't they talk about the fact that it's a provable lie that Jeffrey Epstein and Bill Gates met in 2011? There's attestations that they met in the 1990s all over the place. Why wasn't Mark Middleton covered at any point by US media? He's meeting with Jeffrey Epstein at the White House in the 90s 17 times, at the same time that Mark Middleton is involved in what was investigated by Congress and deemed to be a major national security scandal. George W. Bush, the first time he ever invoked executive privilege as president was to prevent documents about Mark Middleton being made available to congressional investigators. And then 9/11 happens a couple weeks later, and no one in Congress cares about Mark Middleton anymore. Mark Middleton testified to Congress about all this stuff. He pleaded the fifth 28 times, including to the question, are you a foreign agent? Mm-hmm. And they released the fact that Epstein is meeting with this guy a lot more than previously reported, and then he ends up dead after being protected for like decades by two presidents. And it doesn't get coverage at all. Why does it get no coverage? When Gary Webb was talking about the same group and what they were doing in the early 90s and the late 80s, and a lot of people focus on what he talked about in Dark Alliance, but they don't continue following that group to the present. They're still around and they're still very influential. So it's very important to inform people the nature of the power structures that are running our lives. Well, if you look at MCA, Universal Studios, Lew Wasserman, people like that, yeah. Lew Wasserman came out of organized crime. He was tied up with Mo Dalitz. He ran MCA, Music Corporation of America, that became Universal Studios. He was very instrumental in the political rise of Ronald Reagan. He backed Jimmy Carter. He backed Bush Sr., and he backed Bill Clinton. Big time fundraiser and a major force behind Hollywood, and also Hollywood's team up with the national security state to influence and propagandize the American public. So if they're successful in making up a ludicrous death story for someone like Epstein, can you think about how many other quote unquote suicides or ludicrous cover stories for something else?
Oh, and back before you had the democratization of sort of access to information via the internet, how on earth would you ever verify Gary Webb's alleged suicide, Middleton's alleged suicide? You'd have to rely on whatever scant reporting you could find in paper version. What I was going to say was, and then to get you to believe the absurd lie, he killed himself. None of the cameras worked. The security guards who were asleep or something, they were relocated. What's the word? Repositioned. No criminal charges, and move on. So
one of the early sexual blackmail ops that I write about in the book, it took place in the 60s, and it targeted John F. Kennedy in the time he was president-elect and inaugurated. He slept with a woman named Mariella Novotny that was basically being used by a mix of organized crime and British intelligence interest. She was brought to the United States. She was involved in the network that was responsible for what in the UK is remembered as the Profumo scandal, which brought down the existing government at the UK in the time. And then she was brought to the US by a guy named Harry Towers, who was nominally a television executive, I believe, but obviously something else. Anyway, the FBI, found her out, and they were going to prosecute her, and they had her client list. Yeah. And somehow she manages to escape. Apparently with the help of the CIA and affiliated factions and British intelligence sort of spirit her off. And the FBI, instead of doing anything with that client list, they destroy it. That's just the history, right, of the FBI. And if you look at how the FBI has interacted with this group since Hoover, which is most of the FBI's history, they cover up for these interests. They don't investigate them. They investigate people that try and expose these interests. I opened my book with a quote. It's from a CIA whistleblower during Iran-Contra testimony, and he's talking about the octopus here. Yeah. So if I can just read segments from that, I think you'll understand what we're dealing with here. So he says in this testimony, he says, who are these people? They are the group that is popularly called the Enterprise. And this was the name of this power nexus we've been talking about in Iran-Contra testimony. He says it's a mix of Republicans, Democrats, mercenaries, ex officio mafia, and opportunists. They are CEOs, they are bankers, they are presidents, they own airlines, they own national television networks. They own 6 of the 7 video documentary companies in Washington, D.C. They do not give a damn about the law or the Constitution or the Congress or the oversight committees, except as something to be subverted, manipulated, and lied to. They abhor sunlight and love darkness. They deal in innuendo and character assassination, planted stories, the incomplete thought and sentence. They burn and shred files if caught. They commit perjury, and when caught, they have guaranteed sinecures or jobs with large U.S. corporations. Now, this is a really important part here. If you let them, they will take over not only the CIA, but the entire government and the world, cutting off dissent, free speech, a free media, and they will cut a deal with anyone from the mafia to Saddam Hussein if it means more money and power. They stole $600 billion from the savings and loans and diverted our attention to the Iraqis. They are ripping off America at a rate never before seen in history. They flooded our country with drugs. They cut deals with Haro in Mexico, Noriega in Panama, the Colombian drug cartels, Castro, and recently the Red Mafia and the KGB. They ruin their detractors. They fear the truth. If they can, they will blackmail you. He said this in 1990. What has happened since?
That, but I mean, that it seems that had already happened to some extent, and he was describing the past, present, and predicting the future.
Yeah, but what are they doing now? Cutting off dissent, free speech, and a free media. And once they do that, what happens?
Well, someone in the chat in Rumble says China, but
Whitney, Klaus Schwab said it recently, right? China's the model.
Yeah,
but it'll be worse here than it is there right now if these people are not stopped. I guarantee that. If you look at the people behind the National Security Commission on AI, which is creating the policy for the national security state, i.e. the military and the intelligence community as it relates to AI, they say that the only way for the U.S. to maintain economic and military hegemony and beat China is to enact surveillance technology in this type of, control technology far beyond what we see in China today. And they say that it's because if you think of AI, in order to have the best AI algorithms, you have to have more data. So currently in China, you have a larger population producing more data than Americans per capita. So now with a smaller population, we have to be producing just as much data, if not more data, right? So we have to have these types of technologies inserted into our lives in a way that is much more extreme than what is currently in force in China today. And the people on this commission are the intelligence community, the military, and the top people in Silicon Valley. It was run by Eric Schmidt. And if you listen to Eric Schmidt, he just wrote a book with Henry Kissinger about the age of AI and how basically the AI is going to be charge of government soon and all sorts of stuff. But this particular group, the National Security Commission on AI, before COVID said, in order to beat China, quote unquote, beat China, we have to eliminate legacy systems in the US. To them, legacy systems are things like private car ownership, in-person doctor visits, using cash at a store, buying in person in a shop. All of that stuff they want to get rid of, and they want to make it on an app on your phone that they can surveil you and control you and just data mine off of you. And if you are the national security state, what do you care about the most? military and economic hegemony. And that's how they're selling it. And so that's what these people, one of the main power factions in the U.S.
Whitney,
Sorry, I froze for a second.
Okay.
Is that this is the ambition from 2019 before COVID, right? And they used COVID to advance a lot of this and push for all this contactless stuff and the end of in-person interaction, really in favor of using, generating more data and all of this stuff. But this is one of the most powerful factions in the U.S. today, is the fusion of Silicon Valley and the national security state. Most Silicon Valley companies, the big ones, are also military and or intelligence contractors. And a lot of the big Silicon Valley companies today, Google, Facebook, Palantir, they all have direct ties in their origin stories to the national security state, either the military or the CIA. So these guys work together and they have a very particular agenda. And they do not care about democracy. Actually, in their documents in this National Security Commission, one of the things they promote the most as a major change that needs to happen in the US is that we adopt what they call the Chinese model of the civil military fusion concept. And that's basically, the way they describe it in practice would be like fascism.
If the government says disperse and you don't, well, then we freeze their bank accounts and starve them out. And, sure. it would be very effective. Now we just have to discuss whether or not we can justify it constitutionally, but, live under a perpetual state of emergency where the government says emergency, civil rights don't apply anymore, freeze off their bank accounts like they're doing in China currently to obtain maximum compliance. You can't live. They don't have to kill you. Wow.
But that's the future we're moving into. Look at central bank digital currencies. Mm-hmm. The whole point of that is programmable money so that they can just turn off your money if you do the wrong thing. You support the wrong cause, your money's off. Your bank account's gone. You can't spend your money. And even if you don't do anything wrong, right? If you look at most of the pilots for central bank digital currencies right now, they have expiration dates, the money. So if you don't spend your money by that date, it's worthless. So from the off with central bank digital currencies, you don't decide if you save or spend. The state, the central bank, decides that for you. What else will they decide? They can program any functionality into that money. You're under lockdown and you're not allowed to buy or go 5 kilometers beyond your house. Your money won't work 5 kilometers beyond your house. They have that power with this money. So what we saw in Canada with the trucker protests and how bank accounts were weaponized, that is a taste of what is to come. And that is why it is so important to look at building parallel economic systems, because what they are going to try and do is use that control of the financial system to herd us all into smart cities and basically what amount to digital concentration camps, and just Orwellian surveillance nightmare cities, basically. And if we are slaves to the financial system, that may happen for some of us if we do not adapt and make plans to have our money, function differently outside of these systems. That's what people in the Bitcoin space are trying to do, but it doesn't even have to be that, right? You can go back to trading and bartering. You can make a local currency in your community. A great resource for this is someone like Catherine Austin Fitts, who's done a lot of work about the different parallel economic systems you can develop in your community to not have to rely on these super corrupt banks and corporations for your livelihood and your existence. We have outsourced our wealth and also our basic needs to corporations and banks that are trying to enslave us right now. And we have to take that power back, or they will enslave us. And it's very simple, but it requires that we start taking responsibility for ourselves and our communities, and it needs to happen now. Going back years and years, these smart city policies and designs have been on the books, and most major metropolises in the world have some sort of smart city plan that's either already being implemented or is set to be implemented soon.
People are going to say, oh, it would be a seamless society. I'd have a rice-sized chip in my hand like they installed in 6,000 people in Sweden, and I just have to swipe it. And it's so convenient.
How convenient. Yeah. Well, convenience is the carrot that's being used to lead people into a slavery system. Because Bob Moran, if you're familiar with him, he had a really great cartoon about convenience. And it was, this guy on a computer, he was like, oh, how convenient. And then on the smartphone, oh, how convenient. And then by the end of it, he's in a prison cell. He's going, ooh, how convenient.
Well, let's say
because he doesn't have to worry. His food is brought to him. He can just lay down and sit in bed all day.
Plus
how convenient, right? And eventually,
I was going to say, stick a VR set on his head, and he can live a better life in that prison in his mind's eye. It's
that's the whole point of the metaverse. It's basically the Matrix, and it's an awful idea. So there was this really disturbing article I read about the metaverse. I think it was written by an ex CIA analyst, and at the end of it, he said something like, the more miserable life becomes in the real world, the better life will look in the metaverse. So, this manufactured food and energy squeeze we have right now, how bad are they going to make things for people? And then they'll be like, well, come to the promised land of the universe and become a human battery, basically, or something like that. I mean, who knows how exactly it'll manifest, or, none of it's good. I'll just put it that way.
Or in Canada, make life sufficiently miserable that you have people who choose death
who choose euthanasia because they're either too poor, or they're being lobbied in some cases by nurses that they should consider killing themselves because you're a burden on the healthcare system. So go kill yourself.
No, a burden on the healthcare system. It's not going to get any better for you. The government doesn't have deep pockets to give you accommodated living. So have you thought about a maids? All right. Well, people want something of a white pill, Whitney. I mean, what organizations, what entities are pushing back? How can people do it in a lawful?
People can do it. There is a huge white pill, because all it is people have to get off their knees. People have to take responsibility for themselves and their communities and start building something else than a system that's run by criminals. If you don't want to be ruled by criminals, make another system. That's all we can really do, because the system as it exists right now has been weaponized against us and only leads to one place. If your money isn't going to investing in your local existence, your local community, your local neighborhood, parallel systems at the local level that will keep you and your family alive, if you're donating to some organization thousands of miles away from you, how big will that impact be in your life when push comes to shove?
Mm-hmm.
I have a series that I'm co-writing with a really brilliant writer named Ian Davis, who's based in Britain, about the Sustainable Development Goals. So you may have heard about Agenda 2030, but really Agenda 2030 is agenda for the Sustainable Development Goals. Like, the Sustainable Development Goals are Agenda 2030. Yeah. And so there's 17 of them. And so we're trying to go under the hood of each Sustainable Development Goal and show you what's really going on, because each goal has a very flowery little phrase that describes it. But when you get into the policy documents, the public-private partnerships that are responsible for developing the policy that countries are then expected to implement as part of Agenda 2030, then you start to see what it's really about. Right. And so what we're trying to do is show, pretty much what every Sustainable Development Goal is really about. And what they're ultimately about is creating a new financial system that benefits the elite, but not you, and centralizing control over everything about your life, from the most micro to the most macro. It's basically showing you that this flowery agenda that they're framing as the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. We need to come together and community, blah, 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 and all of these buzzwords. It's obviously about creating, when you look at what's actually going on, it's creating a neo-feudal system. So most of us will be serfs, and then there'll be the elite technocrats on the top who make all the decisions for everyone's lives. And you just have to do what's best for the community, but the community doesn't get any say in it. Right. That's just the people at the top that decide.